Edward Blake, once the heartbeat of the USS Valor, was turned away as a civilian despite spotting a critical flaw in her systems. His quiet warning dismissed, the ship soon suffers a near-catastrophic failure at sea, just as he predicted. As panic spreads on board, Admiral Grant demands answers and quickly uncovers the truth. They ignored the only man who could have saved them. Now the crew must find Edward and bring him back, not just to fix a ship, but to restore the trust lost through pride and oversight. Can a forgotten sailor become the key to the Valor's future? If this story moved you, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to our channel. Help us continue sharing powerful tales of quiet courage and unsung heroes like Edward Blake. Your support keeps their stories alive and reminds us all that strength in service, wisdom, and humility. A young officer stepped forward, voice sharp and clipped with authority. "Sir, civilians aren't allowed aboard. I need you to step back." Edward Blake didn't argue. He didn't plead or explain. He simply kept his gaze fixed on the ship, his expression unreadable. Every curve of her hull, every seam in the steel, every scar from battles long past, it all brought back memories. She was once his home, a living thing made of steel and salt and stories. He gave a subtle nod, quietly slipped the folded clearance papers back into his coat, and turned around. His boots landed heavy on the weather-worn boards of the pier as he walked away. They had shut him out, the man who had once built the very heart that beat within that ship. But when the USS Valor faltered, when systems failed and no one else could fix what was broken, they had no choice. They came back for him. Now, in the stillness between steel and sea, Edward Blake returned, not as a soldier, not as a crewman, but as the last hope. Alone, he reached into the very soul of the ship, touching something no one else could mend. From a forgotten sailor to an unexpected hero, the world had no idea what he was about to do. Even as a child, Edward Blake had always felt the call of the ocean. Raised in a modest coastal town, his days were often spent seated at the edge of the old docks, legs swinging freely as he watched fishing boats come in with the morning tide and disappear again by dusk. His father was a fisherman, weathered hands and quiet wisdom. His grandfather had been a shipbuilder, measuring dreams in planks and rivets. For Edward, the sea wasn't just part of life. It was in his blood. While other boys imagined skyscrapers and foreign cities, Edward's imagination stretched only as far as the horizon. He dreamed of creaking hulls and groaning engines, of salty wind and the rhythmic crash of waves against steel. By the time he turned 18, there wasn't really a choice to be made. The sea had already claimed him. Enlisting in the United States Navy felt more like stepping into a life already written. With just a worn canvas duffel over his shoulder and a heart full of purpose, he boarded his first vessel. He wasn't the strongest recruit, nor the loudest or the quickest. But Edward listened. He watched. He learned, not just from the manuals or the officers, but from the ship itself. From above deck to deep below, he paid attention. Storms became his teachers. He learned to stabilize a failing power system while waist-deep in freezing water, to hold his tools steady as hurricane-force winds slammed into the hull. He repaired what others gave up on. Not because he was fearless, Edward felt the fear like everyone else, but because he refused to let fear win. His presence in chaos was steady, grounded. He didn't bark orders. He didn't need to. There was a kind of trust that grew around him, built slowly, forged in crisis. His shipmates began to seek his counsel, follow his lead when systems failed and alarms screamed. Of all the ships he served aboard, none mattered more than the USS Valor. She wasn't the Navy's finest in terms of technology or firepower, but Edward didn't need perfection. The Valor had soul. She had quirks, yes, temperamental engines, a stubborn hull, but she had personality. Edward served 3 tours aboard her. Over time, their bond deepened. He knew the exact sound her engines made when they were in perfect rhythm. He could sense when something was off by the tone of a vibration or a faint rattle. She wasn't just a ship. She was alive. She was family. When Edward's service ended and civilian life began, it was like stepping into stillness after years of motion. Without the hum of engines, the clang of tools, the roll of waves beneath his feet, Everything felt too quiet. He drifted from job to job along the docks, nothing glamorous. Boat repairs, odd maintenance pacos, inspections, the kind of work others overlooked. It didn't pay much, and he didn't ask for more. He never complained. He showed up early, left late, and treated every vessel, no matter how small, with the same reverence he once gave the Valor. His apartment was modest, just a short walk from the water, where the scent of salt still floated through the cracked window panes. The Navy pension was just enough to cover essentials, leaving little to spare. But Edward never asked for favors, never leaned on anyone. His dignity lived in the details, in the way he polished his boots, the care he gave to every bolt he tightened, the way he nodded to passing sailors with quiet respect. On a small wooden shelf in his apartment sat a plaque etched with one word, Valor. He polished it every Sunday morning. Above it, a single photograph hung, faded and yellowing. The ship at sea, Edward and his crewmates standing at attention on her deck, wind in their hair and pride in their eyes. To most, she was just another aging warship, past her prime, destined for decommission. But to Edward Blake, she was something more. She was memory, identity, loyalty, all welded into steel and carried across every wave. And no matter how many years passed, no matter how far the world moved on, that connection never broke. Not even once. It was still early when Edward Blake arrived at Pier 7. The morning air carried a brisk chill, tinged with the sharp scent of salt water and diesel fuel. Ahead of him, the USS Valor rested quietly at the dock like a massive beast in slumber. Her once proud gray hull, dulled by years at sea, caught the soft blush of sunrise as light slowly spilled across the harbor. Edward stood motionless, taking in the sight with a stillness born of reverence. Time had clearly left its mark on the ship. He could see it in the streaks of rust bleeding along the seams, the chipping paint clinging stubbornly to the gun mounts, and in the cables once taut and proud, now sagging ever so slightly under their own weight. Yet to Edward she remained nothing short of majestic. Adjusting his cap and drawing his weathered navy coat tighter around himself, he stepped forward with a quiet resolve. The wooden boards beneath his boots creaked as he made his way toward the boarding ramp. In his hand, he held a folded piece of paper, a clearance slip, or so he hoped it would still be recognized as. It had been issued years ago during the Valor's decommissioning. Whether it still held any true authority didn't matter much to him. In his eyes, it was enough. Enough to grant him one last look, and maybe, just maybe, a chance to be of use. At the base of the ramp, a young officer emerged from the shadows. His uniform was immaculate, his bearing precise and unwavering. The gold stripes on his sleeve glinted sharply in the morning light, and the tag on his chest read, Cooper. Lieutenant Ryan Cooper looked barely older than 28, his expression one of quiet discipline and rigid adherence to duty. He stood straight as an arrow, every inch of him shaped by regulation and order. Edward offered a respectful nod. "Morning, Lieutenant," he said evenly. "I'd like to come aboard for a moment, just to take a look. I served on the Valor for many years." He held out the paper. "Brought this in case it's needed." Lieutenant Cooper didn't even glance at it. His voice was clipped, professional, and unmistakably firm. "Sir, civilians are not permitted aboard during active operations. Please step back." Edward blinked, momentarily taken aback by the curt dismissal, but not offended. Instead, his eyes wandered back to the ship. From his angle at the bottom of the ramp, he caught sight of several young technicians huddled around a secondary power panel on the upper deck. Something about the setup snagged at his instincts. He narrowed his gaze. He stepped just slightly closer and lowered his voice. "Lieutenant, if I may, there's an issue with that panel. The cooling bypass appears to be out of alignment. That could push your auxiliary systems into overload." The young officer's posture stiffened. His training urged him to control the situation, to enforce boundaries, to follow the chain of command without deviation. A civilian commenting on technical matters was outside his protocol. His tone remained cool. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This area is restricted. Everything is under control." Edward hesitated, heart heavy with concern. What he saw wasn't just an educated guess. The configuration, the subtle modifications to the panel, the angle of a redirected conduit, the slight gleam of bolts recently loosened. Each detail whispered of risk, of something overlooked. The kind of oversight that didn't matter until it mattered too much. Still, there was no invitation in Cooper's stance, no space for conversation, let alone correction. With a quiet sigh, Edward gave a small nod. He folded the clearance paper back into his coat pocket and let his eyes linger on the ship that had once been a second home. Every curve of her hull, every scar in her steel, every burnished weld carried memories. "Of course, Lieutenant," he said gently. "No trouble meant. She's a fine ship. Take good care of her." There was no resentment in his voice, no edge, just sadness, quiet and deep. He turned and began the walk back down the pier, each step slow and deliberate. His boots struck the planks with a rhythm that echoed against the morning calm. The wind began to stir again, bringing with it the metallic clink of chains, the groan of taut mooring lines, and the low, humming thrum of ship systems waking for another day's duty. Behind him, Cooper stood still for a moment, watching. He saw the slight sag in the older man's shoulders before turning his attention back to the ship. In Cooper's mind, he had done what was required, maintained order, upheld protocol, secured the perimeter. There was no room for sentiment in an operational environment. But Edward's chest ached as he walked. It wasn't wounded pride, it was the ache of helplessness, the gnawing thought that maybe, just maybe, he could have stopped something from going wrong. That the Valor and the men and women serving aboard her deserved more than silence in the face of risk. At the very end of the pier, Edward paused. He reached out and ran his weathered hand along the edge of a mooring post, as if touching the steel might still tether him, even faintly, to the ship he loved. The cold metal bit into his skin, grounding him. With one last glance at the Valor, he drew in a deep breath of sea air and continued down the pier, the silhouette of the ship slowly shrinking behind him as the sun climbed higher into the sky. The morning broke quietly, the kind of calm that often masks approaching trouble. The USS Valor, sleek and proud, stood poised at the dock, its crew unaware that the man who might have safeguarded their mission had just been dismissed, sent away without fanfare. No speeches, no farewell, just silence. And the very next day, Valor set out to sea, confident and unshaken. The skies stretched wide and cloudless, the ocean flat like glass beneath them. Conditions sailors dream of. The decks were alive with energy. Young officers moved swiftly, their steps crisp and assured, boots striking steel with the rhythm of purpose. Below, the mechanical heartbeat of the ship pulsed strong. Upgrades had been rushed through at the last minute, adjustments meant to sharpen performance during the week's tactical drills. The engineering crew, full of bright minds, fresh from academies and technical programs, trusted their calculations, their craftsmanship. They had done their part, or so they believed. Once Valor crossed into open waters, what began as a standard training exercise slowly started to unravel. It was subtle at first, a minor fluctuation in auxiliary engine output, too minor to draw attention. Then came a faint, acrid scent, wiring beginning to overheat near one of the secondary control panels. Control room lights flickered uncertainly, monitors blinked to black before coming back online. Still no one panicked. But beneath the deck, the very cooling system Edward Blake had warned about strained against the load, faltering under pressure. On the bridge, Lieutenant Ryan Cooper was overseeing operations when the first undeniable signs of failure hit. A voice came through the comms, young, alert, edged with concern. "Sir, we're seeing a temperature spike in the thermal control compartment. Sensor data's all over the place." A knot twisted in Cooper's gut. He masked his fear with orders. Reroute power to backup systems. Recheck system integrity. But before his command could be fully executed, a piercing alarm erupted across the bridge. Red lights flared. The emergency override had triggered. The thermal control system had reached critical temperature and shut down to prevent catastrophic failure, exactly as Edward had warned. Chaos rippled through the lower levels. The engineering team jumped into action. Two junior technicians stared helplessly as error codes streamed faster than they could comprehend. "We're losing control of the auxiliary engines," one of them shouted. "Propulsion is shutting down. Automatic lockout has kicked in." Panic surged in Cooper's chest. This wasn't a scenario they'd rehearsed. He seized the radio. Engineering. Status? Can we contain it? A voice trembling replied through static. We're trying, sir, but the cooling bypass has failed. We're venting heat, but it's not enough. We've started evacuation of the lower compartments as a precaution. On board, fear began to spread. Emergency doors sealed, safety protocols kicked in, but it was too late to restore control. The USS Valor floated adrift, its engines silenced by the very systems designed to protect her. On the bridge, Lieutenant Cooper stood frozen, the red lights washing over his pale face. The weight of failure pressed down on his shoulders. His thoughts drifted to the man at the dock, Edward Blake, his voice calm, his gaze clear, his warning ignored. Elsewhere inside the operations center, Admiral Samuel Grant stood with arms folded, eyes locked on the monitors. His silver hair and weathered features marked decades at sea, tempered by war, storms, and near disasters. His instincts had been sharpened by countless tests of command. He had watched this crew prepare, watched the exercise begin, and now watched helplessly as his ship went dark. Lieutenant Cooper, Grant said, voice firm but measured. Cooper turned, chest tight. Sir, we've suffered a systems failure in thermal control. The auxiliary engines shut down automatically. We've lost propulsion. We're dead in the water. Grant's eyes narrowed slightly. Why didn't the pre-checks catch this? Why wasn't the bypass system tested? Cooper faltered, mind racing back through every moment since they left port. He saw the old man again, Edward, his calm insistence, his detailed knowledge, the way he'd been brushed off as a nobody. Sir, yesterday there was a civilian. He mentioned this issue, but he wasn't authorized and Grant's face remained composed, but a flicker of intensity flashed in his gaze. A civilian saw what our engineers missed? Cooper nodded slowly, his throat dry. Yes, sir. Admiral Samuel Grant turned slowly toward the ship's console, the cold metal railing under his fingers tapping a restless rhythm. Around him, the operations center of the USS Valor buzzed with controlled urgency. Emergency systems had come online, damage teams scrambled through quarters, and internal temperatures had begun to stabilize. The worst had passed, but the Valor still floated aimlessly, not crippled by enemy missiles or towering seas, but by something far more human. An overlooked warning and a moment of prideful dismissal. A single blind spot had brought this steel titan to a halt. Grant's expression was hard and unreadable, but his mind churned. He had seen his share of failure over the years, failures born of chaos, of violence, of nature itself. But this one stung deeper. This wasn't a machine's error. It was a failure of leadership, of judgment. And now a name had begun to circulate, whispered in quiet corners of the ship. Edward Blake. The man who had tried to speak. The man they hadn't listened to. Standing motionless before the observation pane, Grant stared into the sea, gray and endless beyond the glass. He had been with the Valor through nearly every phase of her long, storied life. Once a frontline battleship, then decommissioned, and later resurrected as a training vessel, she had been his command and his responsibility for over 2 decades. He had guided her through drills, tours, storms, and shipyard overhauls. And now she drifted powerless, not because of what she faced, but because of what they had failed to hear. Without turning, he spoke to his aide, his voice low but firm. I want the name of the man who tried to warn us. I want it now. The aide gave a brisk nod and disappeared down the passageway. Grant didn't wait. He moved swiftly to his quarters, bypassing protocol, diving directly into the ship's oldest technical archives. Schematic after schematic scrolled across his terminal. Blueprints, crew logs, maintenance reports from decades past. His fingers paused as one name, buried in the margins of a yellowed maintenance diagram, caught his eye. Edward Blake, Chief Maintenance Supervisor, USS Valor. Grant leaned back slowly, the name dragging a memory from the depths of his mind. A briefing years ago, a man in worn coveralls standing near the back of the room. Quiet, observant. He hadn't said much, but Grant remembered the intensity in his gaze, how he looked at the ship like it was a living thing. By mid-morning, the aide returned, slightly out of breath. Sir, we found him. Edward Blake, retired, works small engines at the Norfolk Marina. Some of the yard crew know him. Grant didn't hesitate. Send someone. I want him back aboard the Valor, and with respect. At the marina, the Navy's request reached the foreman, who pointed a young officer toward a quiet corner where aging fishing boats and rescue skiffs waited for new life. Under a rusted hoist, Edward Blake worked in silence, sleeves pushed up, hands deep inside a protesting engine. The moment the officer approached, Edward straightened slightly and glanced up, eyes sharp, instantly catching the uniform and what it meant. The officer hesitated. This man, dismissed and ignored just days before, now stood at the center of the ship's future. He cleared his throat. "Mr. Blake, the Admiral requests your presence aboard the Valor." Edward didn't ask questions. He didn't blink. He simply wiped his hands on a rag, voice steady. "The ship's in trouble?" The officer gave a single, silent nod. Without another word, Blake gathered his tools, set them aside with practiced care, and followed. As they walked the dock, word traveled quickly. Around them, welders paused their arcs, mechanics straightened, and dockhands leaned on crates, quietly watching. A few exchanged looks. Some nodded knowingly. One grizzled mechanic, arms crossed over his oil-stained vest, let out a quiet chuckle. "Took them long enough," he murmured. "Had gold sitting under their noses the whole time." Another nearby man added, "That Blake, he knew that ship better than the men who built her. Never talked much, never needed to. Just did the work. Got her through hell more times than I can count." Stories followed in Blake's wake. Tales told in quiet corners of stormy nights when he'd worked double shifts, of desperate moments when he patched systems mid-crisis while others panicked. They remembered how he trained new sailors not with manuals, but by showing them how to feel the ship, how to listen to its subtle rhythms, the heartbeat of steel and steam. Blake had never cared about medals, recognition, or rank. He left no glory behind him. Only the kind of quiet excellence that people never forget. Only respect remained. When Edward Blake returned to the Valor, he paused at the foot of the ramp. The ship, scarred and aged, greeted him like an old friend, its steel body worn but dignified. There were no questions this time, no cold stares or dismissive remarks, just quiet salutes and a silent recognition that a past wrong was being set right. On the deck, Admiral Grant stood waiting, watching the older man approach with a sense of long-awaited relief. They had once pushed away the very man who had helped build the soul of this vessel. Now maybe they had a chance to undo that mistake. Each step Edward took onto the USS Valor carried the weight of decades, memories, regrets, pride. The ship seemed to acknowledge his return, or at least that's what stirred deep within him. The soft hum of her systems, the creak of her hull as she floated gently on the sea, the familiar tang of salt and metal in the air, all of it felt like home, like slipping into the embrace of something that had never truly let go. Near the command tower, Admiral Grant waited, accompanied by Lieutenant Cooper and 2 engineering officers. Grant stepped forward first, his expression solemn, respectful. He extended a hand. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Blake. We should have listened to you the first time." Edward grasped the Admiral's hand firmly, the strength in his grip belying his age. "Thank you, sir, but I didn't come back for apologies. I came back for the ship." Grant nodded slowly. In that moment, words became unnecessary. He understood. Below deck, the control room was a picture of quiet tension. The young engineering crew, capable but visibly shaken, gathered near the open system panels. Warning lights blinked across the consoles. Hastily rigged bypasses stretched across circuits. Stress fractures were visible in critical systems. Edward took it all in, expression calm. He didn't come to point fingers. He came to restore. He stepped forward and ran his hand gently along the edge of the main thermal control housing, like a physician feeling for a pulse. "Who modified the bypass?" he asked, voice low but firm. A young engineer stepped up, barely 25, nervous. "I did, sir. We didn't have the original parts. We had to improvise." Edward nodded, not unkindly. "I can see that. You did what you thought was necessary. But come here, look." He knelt beside the panel, fingers moving with practiced ease, tracing the wiring. The team gathered, watching closely as he pointed to a small cluster where the insulation had worn thin, rubbed raw by an improvised bracket. This, this is where the failure started, he said, voice even. The friction weakened the shielding. Moisture got in. That triggered a short. The overload knocked out your cooling relay. The young engineer swallowed hard, the realization hitting with force. But Edward didn't scold. His tone stayed steady, even encouraging. You made a good call, adapting under pressure. Now let's fix it right. He turned to the rest of the team, their anxious faces now attentive, focused. First, isolate the damaged lines. Then recalibrate the auxiliary sensors. Reinforce the panel housing using whatever materials you have on hand. We don't have time to wait for replacement parts. The Valor doesn't have time. Together they worked, youth and experience side by side. Edward's hands moved with a steadiness earned through decades of service. He taught them to reroute power safely, how to test each connection properly, how to listen to the subtle vibrations that told a seasoned ear the system was balanced. Hours passed, but Edward showed no sign of fatigue. To him, this wasn't labor. It was devotion. It was answering a call that had never really left him. At one point, Lieutenant Cooper stepped into the room. He stood in silence for a while, watching as the once flustered team now moved with clarity and confidence under Edward's watchful eye. The lieutenant approached cautiously as Edward finished securing a junction box. "Mr. Blake," Cooper began, then paused, uncertain how to continue. Edward looked up, meeting his eyes with quiet reassurance. "No harm done, son. You did what you believe was right. Now let's make sure this ship gets back to where she belongs." In those words, a bridge formed, one that spanned generations. No blame, no resentment, just mutual purpose and respect. When the work was done, the Valor systems sang in harmony once again. Steady green lights glowed across the panels. The cooling relays held firm. The auxiliary engines, once crippled, now responded with strength. Edward Blake stood quietly as Admiral Grant joined the small group of engineers. He stepped back from the console, wiping his hands on a rag still stained with the ship's past struggles. Grant's voice was low but firm. "Mr. Blake, you've given this ship her strength again. We couldn't have done it without you." Edward shook his head with a modest smile, one corner of his mouth lifting gently. "You could have. I just helped you see what was already there." As the USS Valor prepared to power up for another sea test, Edward remained alongside the young crew. He was no longer merely a remnant of a bygone era. He had become a guide, a steady hand bridging the past and present. The ship, once fractured and weary, now surged with new energy. Her engines purred steadily, the deck beneath them calm and sure. She moved slowly out of the harbor under the soft blush of the morning sky. The ocean was wide, peaceful, welcoming, a clean slate for a ship reborn. No alarms flickered, no uncertainty trembled beneath her hull. The technical problems that once crippled her had finally been resolved. On the bridge, Admiral Samuel Grant stood tall, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze focused beyond the waves. Below deck, the crew moved with a quiet confidence that hadn't existed the day before. Their steps were measured, purposeful, like people who now believed in the ship and in themselves. Somewhere near the engineering bay, Edward watched silently, arms folded. He wore no uniform, bore no insignia, but every person on board recognized his presence. They didn't need the patches or titles to know what he meant to the Valor. He belonged. At midday, the emergency drill commenced. It simulated an engine failure, a fire alert in the secondary compartment, and rapid maneuvers meant to stretch every system and test the crew's reaction under stress. But this time, the Valor didn't falter. She answered the call like the proud vessel she had once been, and had now become again. Her cooling cycles operated with mechanical grace. Sensors fed clean, accurate data straight to the bridge. The auxiliary engines, long a cause for concern, held strong, delivering stable power across the entire sequence. The engineering team, fresh from Edward's quiet but thorough instruction, read every panel, tracked every number, and adjusted without hesitation. Their understanding wasn't just technical, now it was instinctive. They no longer just operated the systems, they respected them, trusted themselves. On the bridge, Lieutenant Ryan Cooper reported updates over the comms, his tone steady and composed. Gone was the anxiety that had once crept into his voice when systems failed around him. In its place was calm assurance, the kind born not from theory, but from lived experience. He understood the ship now, understood the systems, understood what it took to keep them alive. Admiral Grant stood back and watched the team with a sense of pride that swelled behind his eyes. It wasn't just the flawless drill that moved him. It was the transformation of his people. He saw how far they'd come, how far a single man's wisdom had carried them. Edward Blake had given them more than knowledge. He had offered something no manual or simulator ever could: real connection to the vessel and her spirit. By the time the Valor returned to port, the sun was sinking low, painting the ship's silhouette across the gold and orange sky. The crew remained at their stations, every system secured, every objective from the emergency drill executed with precision. There were no failures, no missteps, only the soft lapping of water against her hull and the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. Later that night in his quarters, Admiral Grant sat at his desk, a pen in hand and a report before him. He paused several times, struggling to capture all that had unfolded. Not just the operational success, but the human one. He finally finished the report, typed and signed, and at the bottom added a note he felt still didn't quite do justice to the truth. The USS Valor completed her emergency training mission with full system integrity and no technical failures. This success is due in no small part to the contributions of Mr. Edward Blake, retired Chief Maintenance Supervisor, whose unmatched understanding of the ship's original operational foundations was critical to restoring readiness. His guidance not only resolved immediate technical challenges, but imparted valuable knowledge to our engineering team that will serve this vessel well into the future. Admiral Grant placed the pen down and read it through again. He knew the words, though sincere, fell short. Words always did. They couldn't fully capture what Edward had given them, but they would have to be enough. The next morning, as routine operations resumed, a young sailor from the administrative office walked toward the marina. In his hands, an envelope. Inside it was a printed copy of that very report, the final recognition of a man who had quietly saved a ship. Edward Blake's name was printed on the envelope, set aside just for him. He was alone at his small kitchen table when the sailor arrived. The sharp scent of salt air mixed with the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee as it drifted into the room. Edward reached for the envelope with steady hands, carefully opening it. He read the final words in silence, eyes moving slowly over the paper. His face, weathered by years of sea and service, softened. And then, for a long, quiet moment, he simply stared out the window at the distant sea. There were no medals, no cameras, no crowd, no stirring national anthem, or polished speech to mark the moment. But to Edward, that wasn't what mattered. The ship was intact. The crew was ready. The mission was done. And he had done what he'd always done, with quiet conviction and unwavering resolve. He served without ever expecting thanks. But somewhere within the heartbeat of the USS Valor, within the low, familiar hum of her engines and the calm rhythm of her systems, a piece of Edward remained. That connection between a sailor and his ship isn't something that can be fully explained. It's not brash or showy. It doesn't hunger for acknowledgement. It lives in silent, consistent acts of care, of duty, of love, the kind of love that doesn't announce itself, but shows up over and over without fail. Edward Blake's story is a soft echo of a powerful truth. Real strength often speaks quietly. His bond with Valor wasn't about clinging to memories or romanticizing the past. It was about responsibility, about honoring those who came before while guarding those who would come after. In the rush of the modern world, where speed, novelty, and innovation are prized, we sometimes lose sight of those who hold the line quietly. The veterans, the builders, the workers whose steady hands laid the groundwork beneath everything we now race across. People like Edward Blake, who give with no need for applause, remind us that service isn't measured by what we gain, but by what we leave behind, made stronger, safer, better. And maybe in his story, there's something we can carry into our own lives. Maybe it's the reminder to pause, even for just a moment, and notice the quiet strength in someone older. To appreciate the depth of experience in a neighbor, a mentor, someone who has weathered storms we've never had to face. As technology races forward and progress shines bright, The steady hand of experience provides the balance we often need but rarely celebrate. Maybe you've known someone like Edward Blake, a teacher, a parent, a quiet stranger who stepped in when you needed it most, not for recognition, but simply because it was right. Someone who didn't lead with volume, but with presence. If a person like that has left a mark on your life, we invite you to share in the comments. Who was your Edward Blake? What wisdom did they pass on that still stays with you? Let's open the conversation together. Are we doing enough as a society to honor and include the wisdom of our older generations? Or have we, perhaps unknowingly, let it slip away? Edward's quiet journey isn't just about a ship or a sailor. It's about the fabric that holds communities together, the unspoken moments of service, the unseen acts of care, the bridges between generations. We'd love to hear your voice. Share your memories, your thoughts. Stories like this endure only when we carry them forward, together. If Edward's story touched something in you, please give this video a like. It helps others find these kinds of stories. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss a chance to celebrate the quiet heroes in all our lives. Thank you for spending this moment with us. Wherever you are, we wish you calm seas, strong winds, and the heart to serve in your own way, just like Edward Blake.